Okay. Where is Sammy? There he is. Good. So we're now going to start the next part of the program, which I hope will be as engaging and also building on the very good opening session. I'm Dixon de Clèves, and I have the esteemed pleasure of being the chair of this panel session. I am the director of the Prince of Wales Corporate Leaders Group for Climate, also run our EU office for the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, and also am the executive director of the Green Growth Platform. And that's all a bit of a mouthful, but actually, believe it or not, they're all very linked to this agenda. And I, like the others before me, would like to thank Kurt and the Commission for having really, I'd say, the opener to take this risk on this new agenda and to really take us to a totally different level. And I guess the only thing I would say, Kurt, is watch out, because those of us who are here are going to hold you accountable to get done. We're having exactly this conversation inside our esteemed university, the University of Cambridge. 800 years is a long time to church agenda within a university. We've been struggling, actually, as an institute to try to figure out how to bring the very quick turnaround desire of, some of you might think that they're actually not that quick, but actually if you work within a research agenda, they are quite quick. And ensure that the research agenda matches the needs of the policy and vice versa. It's really quite interesting how we're starting to see a brand new discussion occur between the academic community, between business, and also between policymakers. We're looking at brand new innovation in California and the way in which the California Air Resources Board and the government is working directly with business and academia. And we're starting to see very similar types of discussions here in Europe. We have to, not only because of the challenges that we have before us regarding climate change, resource scarcity, etc., but also because of exactly beforehand, the need to totally change the way in which we look at industrial development and the links between industrial development and our new jobs, growth and competitiveness agenda here in Europe, and the put in place in order to stimulate that. We've actually been working directly with business on new business models through our Institute for Manufacturing. We've actually been bringing in new ways to address the value chain and not just look at divestment models, but also positive investment models. And we now actually have banks working directly with the manufacturing sector on to really unlock breakthrough technologies and trying to enable that finance to happen. Working also with associations here that tend to be associated with the barriers around the ETS, with the barriers around decarbonization. We've noticed that by working directly with some of the different sectors in Europe, we've been able to unlock a brand new conversation, how to look at solutions within the demand side management area and within innovation through NAIR 400. And that's opened up a brand new possibility of a positive dialogue with the manufacturing intensives. So we're here at a point where actually progress is starting to be made, but so much more could actually happen. And if together we could work with the Commission to bring this agenda to a brand, very exciting. The last thing I would say, which I would like to build on from this morning's session, is having been in Rabat in a Commission-led initiative to try experts and governments around the INDCs, it was very clear from that there is a brand new development around the exchange between experts and governments, not only in the way in which we can implement the INDCs, which everyone is very clear that Paris is just the implementation, but implementation has to be our focus from here on out, but also the type of narrative that we need to develop together. So I think part of this conversation that we're going to have now is also very much around not just the technology narrative, but the systems narrative, the way in which together we can bring all those different pieces of the puzzle in order to make this exciting, the consumer, for businesses across Europe, for the academic community, and for policymakers. So I have a very distinguished panel. We will try to focus on 5 to 6 minute interventions for each, build on this conversation with you so that we can have a direct exchange, and also bring in some of your questions that we had this morning as we didn't have a chance to open it up to a conversation. And I'm going to start with Gerben Jan, actually, who's a real mover and the shaker in the European Parliament, those of you who have not worked. Someone who continuously questions the way in which we make policy, but also the interaction with business. Gerben Jan, the microphone is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Sandrine, and for inviting me. Can't find him at the moment.
He's over there.
Oh, there you are, yes, yes. Wonderful being here, and not only many thanks for inviting me, but also for organizing the seminar. I have just a few remarks, given the fact that I have a few minutes. My first remark is about denial. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean the general climate there. I think we are already past that point. No, I mean the denial of the speed of the transition. I see at political level, societal level, we simply do not yet are sufficiently aware about the enormous speed of the transition towards a sustainable economy, not in general. And just to give you a few examples of this lack of awareness, if a company like Air France, KLM, is to change the way it does business, you see an incredible opposition coming from their own employees. And they simply do not yet situation where the company is in. There are other examples. Volkswagen is, I think, a very good example. And it's not only the Dieselgate, the whole development of diesel technology. In a few years' time, also European consumers are more looking forward to the next iCar or Google vehicle than the late made by Volkswagen. So you see things happening very, very quickly. One example that shows the speed of the process, just the last couple of weeks, pension funds spending hundreds of billions of euros in investments, and they are changing towards low carbon technology. And even, well, by some called, I don't know how they're called, but a company like BlackRock, the biggest private investor in the world, last week announced that they want to focus much more on low. You see things changing very, very quickly. I have a few very brief remarks on the obstacles for low carbon innovation. One ability of short-term cost statistics than long-term. Our focus is still the next quarter, or when we're lucky, a few months later, the half-year figures, but the longer-term costs and benefits are still unclear. Secondly, in Europe, we have a few structural problems with overcapacity in steel, etc. And politicians, but also business people, they are not focusing on the right problem, that is overcapacity. So you see protective measures, blaming the EU carbon policy for the fact that Tata is deciding to close the steel factory in the UK, which has nothing to do with that. It's just an old steel factory that is for current international competition. Next point is inconsistent policies. I think it has been discussed already. On the other hand, we are still spending billions and billions and billions on promotion of the consumption and production of fossil fuels, which is quite inconsistent. And my final remark, and that brings us maybe to the core of the debate today, is what I would like to call the over-politicization of policy. They're not so. You see politicians, but also lobbyists using that have nothing to do with the science that is behind it. And that is a huge problem in changing the way that slows down the transition. And I'm afraid the rest of the world is not slowing down. So I believe that that is a huge problem in Europe. Sometimes we need less politicians and instead of more. This is one of those occasions where I think that people like me, politicians, are slowing down the transition. This is where we need a very, very, very strong science-based solution and much stronger voice from science. I very much like the idea behind, for instance, climate change, which is science-based and science instead of political considerations. So I'll leave it to that to stay within my few minutes, Sandrine.
It's clear that you're an MEP who understands time. Perfect, bang on. Building on that, just to throw out to the rest of the panel a few key reflection on it. I like your issue around politicization, and I think the key is finding the balance between how long does research take and how can we actually incorporate to our decision-making as soon as possible. And the other key question is the one of around losers and overcapacity, and I hope that our representative from ArcelorMittal in particular can maybe reflect on the point that we need to think about as well, and apologies for sending that to you. If I could move into the...
The winners and the losers.
Yeah, well, the winners and the losers, and maybe we can journey and not call them losers, actually. Call them the new winners if we get this right. Let's move on to Sami, coming from a different, more strategic position as well, I think, within the European Commission and point around the politicization aspect.
Yeah, very good. First question. Here in the room, who can say he's a winner of the low-carbon economy? Just do, like, who is a loser? Okay. No, it's just, I just want to know. Because we always try to name, it's a narrative thing, we name, we don't see them, but that still we know they exist, so it's a difficult exercise, and that's why there is also a political and strategic center within this European Commission to look what's happening behind the economy at the edge of the curve. So I have only 3 remarks, because the list is very long. We could talk about obstacles, non-technical barriers to a lot of different things happening in the EU economy, its energy integration, so the energy union as such. First, it's why are we doing that? It's the strategic of them. Can they be obstacles to real action on innovation strategy for the energy union? So it's the why, the strategic orientations. We do it for the saving the planet, it's the low carbon, but not only directly, it's for competitiveness, but competitiveness within the limits of our planets. And what does mean competitiveness? Is it GDP? Is it growth? Or is it jobs and growth? And there, I think at the EU level, we're trying to give this strategic orientation. This new commission, it's jobs and growth within the limits of the planet. Other strategic orientation that can guide by others as obstacles is the fact that the EU and the President of the Commission wants this to be the world leader in renewable energy. What does that mean concretely in operational terms? Is it the right being the world leader in renewable energy? And finally, it's the first, put energy efficiency first in all the policies, the actions, the instruments that we do. The second is the regulatory framework, the what. What are we doing for this strategic orientation? And here are also good pieces, but also obstacles. And I mentioned the lack ofs or the don't do, lack ofs. We miss this, and that. Don't do this, and that. Just a few. First, I would like to remind that the EU 2020-2030 frameworks for energy union and climate policies, transition, the low carbon, are means of implementation. They are not the objectives themselves, the same. So what do we miss there? And this is really about the regulatory framework. First is the fact to have all the means, instruments aligned. I will conclude with just a few examples about this. Two instruments, the regulatory framework you have is neither locking in innovation, but also allowing innovation, broader innovation into the energy union. I give you 2 examples. The market design, so internal market for energy, electricity and many other sources of energy. How do you make sure that this is open to innovation? You look at renewable, them into the markets. Why? If you better integrate into the markets, then you can have a further push for innovation, developing renewable in the future, and further reintegrate them in the market in the long term. The new same. We want to empower consumers with digital technologies and so on and so forth. How do you make sure that the way that your market is organized will be open for these new technologies, smart appliances, digital, etc., so that the consumers, are they individual consumers, should they aggregate, and so on. So this can be obstacles if you don't have that for innovation. The price signal is the same. Do we have the price signal? No, a weak obstacle for innovation, technical barrier. But we have part of those. We have the ETS. You have also fiscal policies that can be the tools to address this, and you can have a balance between fiscal and market instruments. And also fossil fuel subsidies. These are the don't do that, because we know that there are obstacles for innovation into low carbon technologies. And finally, two different things, important for the Commission. Intelligence in the system. So when you adopt a regulatory framework, what is the effect in the real economy? Are they successes, shortcomings? Are they creating growth, jobs, and so on and so forth? And for this, you need the better capacity to assess the evolving and finally to make projections, modeling into the future. And this is an important thing. And we have key people here around the table who are part of this. But this is, and the last point is enforcement. Enforce your regulatory framework, you don't have innovation. If you have nice standards for CO2 emissions in certain sectors, but they're not enforced, you're directly, it's against innovation. My last word, I'm sorry, it's the third dimension, the third message is the real economy, the society, the how we do that. Why, what, how we do that. And here the main obstacles is the fragmentation. Is in a lot of different places. You have fragmentation of investments. How money invested in innovation is fragmented, even between public authorities, between countries, within the private sectors itself. Fragmentation of the innovation value chain. Is this just research innovation? Is this development? Is it demonstration? Is it deployment to the market? Is it going through development and cooperation, transferring technologies abroad? There's a whole innovation value chain which is very difficult to grasp all together and to articulate it into a policy framework. As far as these are obstacles for innovation. Two last points, the governance. Innovation is not only about the Commission and the Member States and the European Parliament, it's economy, and the real economy itself is fragmented. Is it just the incumbents? Is it the companies which are not in the energy sector directly? Low carbon is much bigger, it's mobility, forces. I think there are trade union representatives here. It's very interesting to hear their aspect. And finally, fragmentation of civil society. It's mean education, because public access them sometimes to use new technologies. So this should be taken into account. The last thing is that time is different. And this is a motto of this Commission, not business as usual. So you can see things I've been saying. In terms of policy framework, it's not only innovation, energy, climate, it's trade, it's development and cooperation, it's competitiveness, it's growth, it's social dimension. So it's many, many different together. It's a coalition of the will win, and not only the win-win, the willing, but also losers. And it's always useful to see losers, to measure them, to know them, and to understand what the policy can bring for them.
Thank you, Sami. And I think you lead in very nicely to our next speaker, who is Benjamin Denis, who will bring in only the overcapacity question within an employment perspective, or the consumer link, and the link also to... Before you start, Benjamin, there are a few things. Focus a little bit on the fragmentation of civil society. I hope you'll focus a little bit on the fragmentation within the investment community as well. Please, Benjamin.
Good morning to all of you, and first thank you to the organizer, the ETUC, to present its views and to participate in this interesting debate. Let me say a few words about the ETUC. The ETUC is the European Trade Union Confederation. We 90 national confederations coming from 40 countries, but also we represent 10 EU sectorial federations like Industrial, for instance, which is represented in the room. Not only because I want to be sure you know who I am representing today, but also because I think interesting to take Sami's question and to translate it into my world. If For instance, the members of my executive committee, okay, guys, ladies and gentlemen, who are the losers, who are the winners from the transition? I think that the picture will be quite different to the one we had just goes. This question is indeed challenging and interesting, but I think that the right place to raise it is maybe not the Berlaymont, but the real world. And what do we see in the real world is that, whether we like it or not, regions, many workers still will rely on carbon-intensive activities, including in Europe. We know through all the studies which have been made that the transition towards a low-carbon economy, unemployment should be, globally speaking, rather slightly positive. But we also know that there will be sectors where the co-benefits of a low-carbon economy will be much more difficult to ensure. We know that in many regions in Europe, we have communities which still highly depend on carbon. And I think it's quite important to remind that when you have local communities, local trade unions, which protest, for instance, against will accelerate the phase out of coal within a country. It's not that much because there is in that region a religion of coal. This is because 2 centuries of industrial activities in that region, most of the jobs available on the carbon market rely directly or indirectly from carbon-intensive activities. Overnight, it needs time, it needs investment. You need also a wide set of flanking social measures to accompany the transition. And the message I would like to convey today, we cannot shift from an economy which fuels to an economy which will be zero carbon in a few decades without changing at the market. That's why we need at the EU level also a set of complementary instruments which will ensure that the costs, that the risks, that the benefits associated to the economy will be shared in a fair way across the EU. And to conclude, I would like to go back to what has been said by Mr. Vandenberg this morning. He said that one of the success of the low-carbon transition was its cost effectiveness. For sure, cost effectiveness is an essential, a crucial prerequisite. But I think that its social impact, the fair, just transition towards a low-carbon economy is also an essential prerequisite for the success of the transition. Because if low-carbon economy is seen as detrimental to, let's say, quality employment, if it is seen as a driver for increasing social equalities, etc., etc., this transition with citizens, and if you lose the in a big and major failure. Thank you.
Benjamin, thank you. You bring up a couple very important points. Also one that translates very nicely into the next conversation that we'll have with Robert Jan. The first also is I think one that we need to look at very carefully when we're actually industrialization anyway, which is the role of employment, but also more specifically labor laws and the high cost of labor across Europe. And I think it's something versus just carbon leakage, because I think that we do have to have a broader spectrum of looking at why industry is staying or leaving in Europe. And is you bring up the very crucial issue of the just transition and the fact that we can't just look at environmental decarbonization. Commissioned actually at the University of Cambridge through the Institute a new study on what does that actually mean, because a lot of people are using it. We're now doing a full peer review on the concept of just, and we hope to have that actually coming out quite soon, so we can start to understand the real narrative of what it does mean, and then start to model it out and have some broader conversations around this. So there are already quite a few thoughts that are coming your way. The price signal is another one, by the way.
I get extra time, huh? Yeah. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, ArcelorMittal. In Europe, direct ones, because also the indirect ones should be counted with that. 900 researchers in Europe to make steel changing every day. The steel we make now, for Dunkirk, we didn't make 5 years ago. It goes very fast, transition in steel to echo Kerbion, things are going fast, but innovation goes very fast, but steel is not steel. Coming back, I will come back to the other points. What the main thing is for this policy, to make my big just bullet points, if we do not attach, link or integrate a circular economy in this climate change policy or low carbon technology, this moment it is a failure because it's not done. For the moment what we do, we promote the use of plastics. It's only the policies based on the production and not on the use. This is a complete failure. So there is a need, there is now in December I think, but also the link with climate change is still not there. And if it's not coming, this discussion is nice, but it's just a discussion. And we hear this for the future, basically of whole society. We can lead that in Europe. So they need to stimulate permanent materials based on a full life cycle assessment. There's much more to say on that, but I have only a few minutes. Then, for the moment, what we see, we try to see what we do with our carbon. Integrate from our process emissions into biofuel. Not possible, DG Climate says, because it's fossil-based. How can you do something better to make from something fossil, something bio? I mean, to make you can actually use it in transport if you want, or in something else. So what we need is an integration actually of the policies, and that policy should not block low carbon technology. For the moment we see that it's basically out of the box thinking. Stop research and how to use CO2. So it's also for the use phase. Then financial, just to be really quickly, there's a lot to say financially, how to stimulate technologies. Demonstration projects, they need 10 times more in funding than others if you do that. So that is not taken into account yet for the moment. But also the financial risk is made for, if it fails, it's a cost for the company. It's not so stimulating to do it then. And these things are really high investment costs, and for investments which go about 30, 40. Worse, what we see now, for instance, on ETS, we get there done, is that ETS is now, and policies sometimes used as, basically as a plain tax, and not meant for low carbon technologies. The main driver for this policy, how it is designed, is a taxation policy. It's just money for the budget. Our main problem is with ETS is not winners or losers, it's the design. It's nothing to do with climate. It's discussing that. But actually what the policy means is they reserve 57% for auctioning. It's a deal with Poland, everybody knows. It's to deal, it can stop, to keep the current Polish coal base. Nobody's hearing about it because it's a deal, a political deal. But what it can do, it can hold the decarbonization, which is going so fast, as everybody says now. It can actually hold that, actually intended to that, to keep the jobs. So that, fine, if you do a political deal, but don't call it then a climate change policy. The result of that is there's way not enough allowance left over for industry. So you can only meet the target by closing down production. This is bizarre, this is not a climate policy. And this is a design issue. So it's about how you want to have winners and losers. If you don't know with the climate policy, yes, we will have winners and losers. But you know what also, then the climate is also a loser. And that's what we have to get the design right. So what we need to have, look at the US, emission performance standards. Extremely successful, the change, okay, it's a different situation. Change from coal to gas goes very quick. They make targets. In the US on steel, we don't see that. Okay, ETS is a completely different ballgame there. So what we need for, and this is we actually needed this discussion 3 years ago here. Yes, based on science, based on objective stuff. For the moment, this is too politicized, and we need to have a bottom-up policy. So we hope this process to actually get the facts right, get it science-based, etc. What we need, for instance, in policy, if you look at the market-based instrument for climate, it indeed works for technology on one price. But that price, by definition, is too high or too low as an optimal incentive for other technology or other sectors. And that's why ETS is great to get to a cap, it works fine. For most sectors as an optimal incentive. So what we need to change is the climate policy to much more targeted. It could be by groups, it could be by technology, it could be by sector, to have the optimal and productive what we're doing. It's actually more counterproductive because the design, and it has nothing to do again with climate change or low carbon technologies, is keeping artificial shortages because there's just not enough allowances anymore. Optimal incentive for a company. If you don't have enough, You cannot invest to a level if you will still have cost. You will not make the low carbon investments. You will make those investments outside Europe. Energy sector, same thing. Don't misuse ETS to save the energy sector. It will get you revenues, no problem. But the energy sector is being phased out by real low carbon energy because there it's possible. And mechanism which you already mentioned, it will all be very expensive for society, but ETS will not make an investment signal for the energy sector. So let's not misuse that to also take away the investment signal for the industry sector, which is now, this is a lose-lose. We know how not to do it, so we need a more targeted signal to do that. And we need it objective and science-based. We need the impact assessment to reflect reality. For the Ecofis will come out very soon with an impact assessment for us. We need to buy 45% at least allowance by 2030, which no steel company can survive that with high prices if to pay it full. This is nowhere to be found in the Commission impact assessment, so which is actually the impact. We need a policy which is based on facts, science-based and objectivity. So this meeting should lead to that process and to really insist on basically get the facts as the basis of policy, and now it's still on the winners or losers again on that. UK, Gerbion, read the papers, it's just one word, China, China and China. Nothing to do with CO2, also never seen that. You mention of energy prices, there could be a component and not heard it, but basically exchange rates. But it's a Chinese problem, overcapacity should not be misused for the...
So I think you've probably opened up a big debate as we move through the panel, and afterwards I think we have to have the discussion. I think the question around design and market design is a good one to bring up, whether the ETS has been properly designed or not. Obviously, I think we'll have a conversation there. But I think design is absolutely fundamental and a very important point, and one that we need to think about as we move into the next phase. There is the modernization 100. There are a variety of other possibilities, FC, etc., to start to bring in funds that could complement ETS revenues. But I think we need to think about that more thoroughly in terms of how it works and leverage. If I could move into our next, and one last point on China. Now that Chinese have brought forward their INDCs, and in particular industry here in Europe has continuously indicated that Europe cannot continue to just show leadership. We have to think through this, because we are no longer showing leadership. Actually, there are 158 other countries that now have joined us. So let's rethink that as well and see what the real impact is in terms of our manufacturing sector. So I do think we have been joined now. Could I ask you, Stefan, to chime in now? Thank you.
Right, thank you. I'm going to, because we only have 5 minutes, I'll be concise. I'm going to focus on, which I think deserve attention in this conversation about barriers to the low-carbon economy. The first is funding the low-carbon society. There are obviously huge, so the renewable energy, low-carbon transport systems, new technologies that have to be developed, new energy-efficient buildings, retrofitting existing buildings. There are huge funding needs, and as funding will not be capable of paying for this. If you turn to the private sector, the challenge is that, one, they suffer from myopia or short-termism, the quarterly profits rather than the long-term profits. They estimate both the risks posed by climate change and the opportunities offered, and have at least some fairly low confidence in governmental climate policy. What I then see as a key solution here is to facilitate green investment. One, incentives such as carbon prices, and that is to some extent working, but perhaps not to the extent hoped for. Where much more effort is needed, and where there hasn't been paid enough attention so far, is in de-risking. Use government funds to mobilize private capital through insurance schemes and various sort of first loss mechanisms that will make it easier for the private sector, even with the shorter-term perspective, to invest in the economy. The second main point concerns public and industry support for policies and technologies. Climate policies need to be sustained for decades, and no policy can be sustained for long off support. What is a sufficient level is not a scientific exercise, it's a political question, but it's obvious that many policies have been defeated because of opposition. There are some good news to begin with. As you build more renewable energy, you create new vested interests, which will fight for more, not less, ambitious climate policies. And we also see across a range of different behaviors that the public typically becomes more favorable benefits of different policies. If they experience that a congestion charge leads to less congestion, lower air pollution, less accidents, they'll support it more over time. So the barriers are not always as straight as we think. What is still lacking is more systematic policy design and communication strategies to build sustained support for the policies. I think one of the best examples we've had of how to do this is of the Stockholm congestion charge, which faced initially quite a high level of public opposition. They then ran a trial period where they implemented the scheme temporarily, at the same time improved public transport, so that they have the benefits of the policy for themselves, which led to just enough support that this passed in the referendum and was implemented permanently in Stockholm. The third main point is that we need to learn more systematics in overcoming the barriers. Who have succeeded and how did they do it? There is often much focus on the technological solutions, but there is at least an equally strong need for political market solutions for achieving a low-carbon economy. How to build public support, for instance, for transport policies, is not just a matter of political craftsmanship. It is a topic that can be research which are generalizables and which can be transferred to other contexts, other countries, other cities. I think that's been a missed opportunity so far, to learn from the best practices, to systematically document the benefits, and how information can be spread and be taken up by other decision makers. Thank you.
Thank you, and also for your efficient keeping to time. And I would like you maybe to come back to some of Norway's experience also around the pension funds, because there's been some very enhancing opportunities there. I did forget to make one very important point, Robert Jan, which you had made on the circular economy, and I would like maybe Kurt for you to come back on that, because I do think you're absolutely correct that other types of industrial policies need to be fully linked up to this agenda, and the circular economy one is a very, very good case in point. It's a real pleasure to be able to, as we move through, have Imke here to society perspective. And if there's some of the issues that have come up that you could maybe think about a little bit, Imke, and then we'll go into Nick and then hopefully open up for conversation.
Yes, thanks, Sandrine. Thanks to your commission for speaking on this panel. We heard this morning many ingredients are there. We thought so in 2011 and commissioned a study about a decarbonized energy system by 95% based on efficiency and renewables. And I think this just makes the point we can do the transition by today because technologies are available. And this links to the point that we think, yes, innovation is needed along the learning and experience we make getting the transition done of technology. And we realize that it's political will, actually, which is a bottleneck of making use of this enormous potential. To have a stable framework to make the transition happen, and a stable framework which is supported by society and that pushes policymakers, which support and is basing the decarbonization on a sustained vision. Currently, we see that with lack of political will, with quite some worriness about the fact that we actually get all important key files tabled next year for decarbonization. So I think decisive, it's very important that we take the stand of, we have the necessary tools and we can make change. We can go along the way quite soon. Next year, with the tables, with the files on our discussion, policymakers need to decide if they go for a transition, if they decide on enabling the market to integrate renewables on a large scale, grids and storage, if we have incentives for CO2 efficient installations, if a lot of these things are decided up next year. So political will be at the key, will be key for any success on decarbonization. To successful low carbon frameworks, and we've seen that stable conditions, political and market conditions, are very, very important. which is seems to be key is deployment of innovation is largely a question of investments. We need both. We need public funding, as we heard several times, but we also know this is a scarce resource. Do we need climate finance and public finance, and how long? We also need sustainable financing solutions. This will for innovation to take place, and innovation can't happen only in large corporates. It needs to take place in a very diverse format. In order to enable that, we need innovation also in the finance sector, meaning we need more clean tech, we need angel investing, we need stock market investing, we need crowdfunding, we need sustainable banks. A lot of these stuff enable for people to solutions. It has been raised before, the transition, the energy transition is about a social transition. And I think the debate in Germany about coal has shown that very, very clearly is the social question behind an energy transition about labor markets and people trying to save their lives. So it's an afterthought about how can we train people, what is climate change, why we need change, and how can we move people to helping develop into different sectors. This is even more true if we look at the transition, looking into 10 different countries, that people are not equally aware of climate change. Being aware of climate change enables a real way about solutions. This is in particular true if you also look back into history, that a lot of innovations, for example, in the agricultural sector, came from people working in these sectors. So it's make people aware for them, enabling them to find solutions. Last but not least, I think it's very much about a collaborative attitude among stakeholders. A collaboration on national level, on regional level, but also on a global level to come up with solutions and to deploy it. We can see that with the challenges on the energy market, that collaboration in order to get the energy market running requires collaboration, exchange, knowledge sharing, and a different level of trust and confidence. I want to raise your attention, which is called Sustainia. I think there are quite interesting examples from 10 sectors showing innovative solutions in 10 sectors with climate benefits. And they've shown the common features across these 10 sectors show that in these solutions, access is encouraged over ownership, provide circularity, they foster digitalization, they move towards a renewables-based system, and they create value as well from local resources. I think it's very inspiring because it brings climate benefits across 10 sectors, and I think there is a lot of innovation for us to take to move along the transition. So the key question will be what we have and how do we bring that into market and get this well implemented in the society. And we clearly think the civil society has an important role to play to take people along policy and measures in Europe and globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Imke. And I think you bring up a very good question for the Commission and one that we need to think about, which is how do we bring incumbents with disruptors together to really think through. We've been starting to do some of that work, but that's a real key issue. And also this brand new co-creation where companies are actually starting to work with other companies within the same sector and sharing IP, which I also think needs to be thought about as we move. Moving on to Nick, and definitely not last but least, but actually a very important contributor to the thinking in the investment community around some of the points that both of the last, Nick.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the Commission for inviting UNEP to present our thoughts here. I come from an initiative of UNEP into the design of a sustainable financial system, and there are copies of our summary on the back table if you like your information in a 20th century paper style. What I'd like to do is give you sort of 4 main thoughts why financial system reform of this transition exercise. If my schoolboy German is correct, die Energiewende braucht eine Finanzwende. Secondly, what does that mean in terms of the regulatory framework? Sami, I think, very interestingly said regulatory framework, but our findings around the world have suggested we need to think about a policy and regulatory framework for the financial system, for banking, insurance, capital markets, and investment. I then touch on some of the sort of key themes in the transition, and it might mean for research policy. I think when we look at the financing challenge, it's not just a question of the clean trillion, the 1 trillion in capital investment we need for low-carbon technologies and energy investment. We really need to think about the whole $300 trillion of assets around the world. And as people have said, how do we ensure that the value of natural capital in the broadest sense is incorporated into the pricing and understanding of risk in all those assets? It's a truly systemic. Thinking across this, we want our financial system to do 3 things, I think. We want it to be efficient. We want it to actually be able to ensure that we're allocating capital least cost. But we know that our financial system is not acting as we'd like it to be. It is very short term, as Stefan mentioned. Horizon, as the Governor of Bank of England has mentioned, we have many misaligned incentives, so that our financial system is not working as it's designed to do. We need it to be effective. We need our capital markets to actually be effective in actually channeling capital transition. But I think if we think of our policy making, we've only really just started. It's very refreshing to see within the CMU action plan here in the Union the mention of the sustainability dimension, but we're really at very early stages. And thirdly, we'll be stable, to be resilient. We know it has a tendency to boom and bust. But in terms of, I think, this agenda, we need to think about the resilience and the risks from the financial system faces in terms of the transition, in terms of stranded assets, in terms of shocks from environmental stress. We also perhaps need to think about what are the risks that the financial system imposes on the rest of the... So I think the first point is we need to think about financial system reform as part of this transition exercise. In terms of the inquiry, we've been working in the last 2 years in many different countries, in Bangladesh, in China, here in Europe, and the UK, in the US, in Brazil, Colombia, around the world. And our work was really to try to understand what is a policy agenda in terms of finance, in terms of enabling the transition development. And I think we're beginning to see what we call a quiet revolution. Really, this year is the first year that really major central banks, major financial regulators are starting to work out what is their role in this transition. And I'd like to give you a very sort of stylized way of the 3 R's: risk, capital raising, and reporting. So in terms of risk, clearly, there are many environmental risks that the financial sector needs to manage. These are managed at the moment. Citigroup, the US bank, has suggested there are $100 trillion of stranded assets through the low-carbon transition that could evolve, clearly would have quite sizable implications. The Financial Stability for Climate Change Systemic Risk Board. But again, we are really at early stage understanding of the risks that sustainability poses for the financial system. Second R is raising. There's a lot of excitement in the markets about green bonds, where you have bonds which are raised and are targeted directly for sustainability purposes. But this is still very early stage. We have good policies tools in the EU, the project bond. But again, we haven't really thought about how we want, for example, the credit rating agencies, which actually signal creditworthiness for $100 trillion of assets, how should they be brought in? And I think this sense of a broader horizon around capital raising, very much Robert Jan's points about making sure decarbonisation is linked to the circular economy, and I think a broader natural capital point. We've been very struck by China's work here. So they're not just supporting making sure green finance is part of the next 5-year plan, but green finance is part of their wider ambition for eco-civilization, a much broader goal than just decarbonisation. The third area is reporting. Many of us have been working from the corporate side. That's becoming quite mature. But I think, again, a new agenda here is actually reporting and disclosure and transparency from financial institutions. I think the leadership here from France as part of their energy transition law is very striking on institutional investors to disclose their contribution to the transition. And I think we've also heard about consumer empowerment. And I think it'd be useful here to think about about the empowerment of financial consumers. How do financial consumers, individuals and others, they need to make the choices they need to make around sustainability? Again, France and also Sweden, I think, doing some very interesting work in this regard. 3 areas, I think, for reflection and policy work, early stage, so research required. Firstly is how do we incorporate sustainability principles into financial policy, whether that's banking, insurance, investment, capital markets. We still don't have that architecture of principles. Secondly is how dynamism, which I think Stefan touched on. A lot of discussion now around so-called environmental stress tests. How do we bring environmental scenarios, carbon scenarios, climate scenarios, water scenarios into today's decision making? And third, a performance framework. How do we know whether our financial system is actually supporting sustainable development? How do we know where the flows of finance are going? How do we know whether our system is actually resilient to climate shocks? A lot of work required there. If I may, we've heard about the need for technological roadmaps, and I think these are very well developed. But we don't have financial roadmaps, and perhaps that's something we need to think about. And the role of research is clearly essential. In our final report, for a research coalition around sustainable finance. But I think what is different here is that we need to think about bringing in new actors to the sustainability agenda. Central banks have large research departments. They need to be brought into this. Financial regulators have research departments. And also we need to think about the regional scope. Much of the innovation on this green finance agenda is not happening in the North Atlantic. It's happening in emerging economies. And how do we bring those voices and those perspectives into this debate? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. Of overview in a very short amount of time. I'm going to now maybe allow for an exchange between all of us, with the panel obviously being part answering questions, but also asking questions, I hope. Within the investment discussion, I would like to come back to the competitiveness angle. I mean, China now, Nick, if I understand correctly, is the #1 green bond market. I think we have to redress this idea that actually the rest of the world is not following through on decarbonization. And we need to think about competitiveness in a slightly different way, which is, will we lose our competitiveness? Actually don't invest. So I'd like just to think about that. I'd also like, one point that did not come up is the change in the role of the consumer as a fundamental source for innovation. I mean, we talk about the prosumer approach, but actually consumers are, I was with Jeremy Rifkin last week, and it was interesting to think that the capitalism actually has moved into what we would in the past have called much more social principles, which is much more collective action or consumer, not because they think they're giving up something, but actually because as individuals they've decided that it's more fruitful to share a car, or it's more fruitful to actually share other types of products and services. That needs to also be a principle of driving our new way that we look at innovation. Innovation doesn't just come from technology drivers or businesses. It actually comes from the integration of new principles of society, and that of course also brings in, etc. So I'll open it up now for a general discussion, and could I please ask you to introduce yourselves and make your interventions short? So we've got one here.
My name is Laurent Zibel. I work for Industry All, which is the Federation of Trade Unions in Industry. Actually, I would have a few observations. One is the mutual dependency between sustainability and social fairness. One is very well known. Fairness is a prerequisite, could be a political obstacle. However, the other way around, it's only socially fair and equal societies that can have the sober consumption patterns that are compatible with. Means that social equality should be central to any sustainability policy. Second point regards contradictions we've been looking at in terms of industrial policy, and I would like to be focused, I think it's between the external competitiveness, energy-intensive industries on the one hand, and the price signals on the other hand that are necessary for investment and for changing these consumption patterns. And finally, I would like to just inform you that we at Industrial Europe have started a project on the long-term consequences of environmental sustainability policies on employment and jobs in one specific sector, that is machine tools and robotics, specifically to be concrete on this sort of fair transition that we are just mentioning. And we're public presentation of the first results of this study on the 27th of November.
Thank you. Maybe we can take a few interventions at the same time. Yes, over here.
Good morning. My name is Laura Burke. I'm the Director General of the Environmental Protection Agency in Ireland and also a member of the newly established Climate Council in Ireland. And I suppose questions and the views of the groups today. We've had industry and civil society and technological discussion this morning, but I'd be interested in the views on who should lead on the transition to a low-carbon economy. Is that government or is it industry? Between market and regulatory drivers. With regard to industry, when it comes to difficult decisions and the short-termism that we've talked about, how committed are industry really to the change or elements of industry? The Clean Air Act in the US, huge opposition to by industry and potentially industry who also claim to themselves to be very conscious of the climate area. And we've also heard of protectionism of existing industry. There was also then discussion, politicisation of legislation. And I suppose the comment I'd make is to remember that the politicians represent society and they often reflect what society are looking for. Or support policy, but science is only one element and you do need good societal engagement, as otherwise you see that policies don't necessarily get implemented appropriately or at all. There is a risk that we try as a very elite group here or other groups to change society from an ivory tower and not really be understanding the issues that the public have. And I'll give an example from Ireland. Wind industry, which is meant to be recognised as a move away from fossil fuels, huge opposition by society to wind farms now. So you need to have that societal engagement. And then my very last question is, we know that regulation can drive innovation and it should overcome, in instances, resistance to change. So how much do you think the innovation should come organically and how much should it be driven?
One more. Yes, over here.
Good morning. My name is Arthur ten Wolde from the Groene Zaken Sustainable Business Association in the Netherlands. I work there as the manager public affairs circular economy subject on behalf of MVO Nederland, CSR the Netherlands, and also on behalf of thousands of companies throughout the EU. So these are front-running companies and also companies that are fast followers. For instance, many cradle-to-cradle companies, and we very much the mentioning of a circular economy as an important theme at this time, and so you would hope that this activity, this program, would be linked to the circular economy package in a way as to support it. And the package is talking about a great deal more of money. It's about 600 billion of annual financial gains to be gained from moving towards a circular economy. At the same time, research and innovation is urgently needable. And one of the issues and the reasons that I'm here today is that for the companies that I now represent, the current, for instance, Horizon 2020 program is not very interesting. It's, by the way, it is structured, for instance, the long lead times, to set up. And don't forget that many of these frontrunners are SMEs, but not only, also large companies, multinationals. So I would like to maybe discuss how we can make this program really accessible and how we can engage these front-running companies.
Okay, I'll take one last question. Sanjeev.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Sanjeev Kirwar, the founder of Change Partnership. It's an interesting conversation. There's two things which I feel uncomfortable with. The first one is the notion that this is a technology and research-led is the solution to climate change. I kind of disagree with it. I think if we need to have innovation, we need to have innovation in terms of governance and politics. After all, climate change and the transition is an issue of ownership. who owns the transition, who is accountable for the transition, who, as a winner and a loser, do I turn to? Don't have an innovation. At the same time, where we do have that going on is actually China. And one of the examples to look at is how China has designed its electric vehicles program. Remember, this is a country which had no background or experience in the automotive sector, more than it's the leading producer in terms of electric buses, electric bicycles, and gradually electric cars and autonomous electric cars as well. And what they did is they created competition amongst regions. So it wasn't picking the winner, it wasn't creating standards, which we had to do. They had a very aggressive policy of regional competition, which allowed all sorts of technologies to be tested, all sorts of infrastructure to be tested, lots of lessons to be learnt, and lots of failure to happen. And the problem with climate change policy discussions in Europe is that it seems to be big institutions or big corporations and big technologies rather than the small. And that doesn't seem to factor into the conversation at all. But a lot of the low-carbon technology is small. Prosumers themselves are small, tiny, independent micro generators in the transition, not necessarily the big corporations and certainly not big governments. So I'd be interested to know how, where the thinking is in terms of government policy innovation.
Thank you, Sanjeev. I think some very interesting ideas coming out of what you've just said. Let's just remember as non-technological barriers and challenging. So we were not wanting to talk about just technology, but actually talk about systems change. But you're absolutely correct. That is fundamental. It's also probably the most difficult. And I know businesses may contest that, but I know how difficult systemic change actually is. And then you bring up a second very good point, which I hope that others will build on. And I'd like to bring in this morning's panelists as well, or speakers to contribute to this conversation. And Kurt, you as well, and Hans also. Because it would be interesting to know how we can bring into this conversation, as they are very important non-state actors also in the action program that we're looking at through the implementation of the INDCs, etc. So that would be very interesting. So some excellent questions. Rebanian, I think there are a couple of on also the legislation rather than other types of pushes, voluntary versus mandatory. We've had that done. Actually, there's been quite a bit of analysis done by the different institutions as to what really makes sense. So can I open up the floor to the different panelists and others want to answer some of these very good inputs? Yeah, why don't you go ahead first?
Yes, thank you, Sandrine, and thanks a lot for the very challenging questions. One that I think I should try to answer is who should lead on the transition coming from. It's very difficult that this is a societal challenge. After 150 addiction to fossil fuels, we have to change that addiction. And we all know how difficult it is to get rid of an addiction. And that is what we as a society have to do, which means that this is much more than just something to be done by the street. This is really a societal challenge. There are a few things that I'm very, very cautious about. One is the term cost effectiveness. Of course, it has to be cost effective, but it's often used to disguise the costs that will be going to be an extremely expensive transition. We all know that. But by using the term cost effectiveness all the time, we sort of disguise the costs. We have to be honest towards the people in the street. This is and of course, people are against any radical change because people in principle are against radical change. And that's why I think your question is very valid on the role of politics and society. They represent voters, but they have to be brave. We need very brave politicians who are not only following what people are thinking at the moment, because, okay, that's pretty far for someone from a party that strongly believes in referenda and direct democracy, etc. But people really don't understand the magnitude of the change that we're facing. So we need politicians to lead them towards that. I think that is a very important element. I cannot believe that those politicians who deny climate change, that they really believe in that. But what you do see, especially in the US, endanger their political future if they do not deny climate change, because that will mean that they don't get the funds that they need to be elected. therefore, I think we need much braver people. One other element was, do we need one big cohesive approach? No, I don't believe in that. That reminds me, I don't know if that's the right term in English, the Tower of Babel. Tower of Babel was a cohesive approach toward one goal. I don't think century. It has to come from all different levels. What we need is a very bright and smart innovation policy that accommodates both big projects but also grassroots, because it has to be disruptive. It will not come from within a lot of the sectors that have to change radically. And I'll leave it to that to not take too much time.
One point on the leadership, and there's a big shift and a challenge for the EU, but which is reflected at the global level in addressing climate change from the Kyoto-like approach and the COP21. Leaders are governments, nations with strong regulatory frameworks, commitments to see, and in COP21, a lot of state but non-state actors, businesses, innovators, and regions, smart cities, and so on. We know that if we want to address it, we need this regulatory framework, the price signal, but we need action above all. The EU needs to shift, of course, build on a strong regulatory framework with governance, targets, and so on and so forth, but also action with investments, innovation, jobs. And this is not only about regulation. And an innovation strategy fits well in the middle. It needs this regulatory framework, but it can be a game changer, making all the changes faster, broader, cheaper, and this is looking at the future. But we cannot just look at the future. We, of course, need to look at the past, the present, and potentially losers, keep them losers for forever. And there, it's, I think, one interesting remark that I heard here is the cost and labor or job effective transition towards a low carbon economy. But accompanying policies, keeping everybody on board, very important, but it's not also justifying bad investment decisions or not the appropriate investment decisions. Look, I take an example. In France, at the end of the 19th, companies could decide whether they would invest in the internet, and at certain point, that those who strongly invested in the Minitel when it was just turning over over internet, then it's this cannot fully compensate public policies. And I will stop that, but what I see is a big shift, not only in governments, but also in private companies. When Barack Obama announced this Clean Act, there was 13 major American firms, some of them advocating carbon leakage in Europe, of $170 billion investments with Barack Obama at the White House in innovation technologies, in decarbonization of their assets, and so on. And you see also a lot of European companies now setting for themselves, regulator, no policymaker asking for it, their own targets. We will limit our investments in 50% in these assets or others. We will limit our CO2 emissions by this and that. So there's a big shift, not only at the regulatory level, but to reflect, to bring all this on board, not only regulation, but investment, innovation, and so on and so forth.
Thank you, Sami. I think also within that context, we do have to remember to not always just look forward, but also look backwards. There have been some really policy engagements and monumental pieces of legislation. For example, all the auto oil legislation, even though VW has done what it's done. The fact of the matter, based on the Clean Air Act, the Chinese are now integrating and very much focusing on auto oil, what we did actually here in Europe. So I do think that we also need to think of those policy engagements where we've been successful here in Europe, and how can we replicate that? It was also the first major long-scale project looking at research, development, as well as technological possibilities, bringing together all the major stakeholders. So I think we can also look at what we've done well rather than just talk about what we've done badly. I think that, Martin, you wanted to say something?
Just very briefly to come down, and Laura mentioned on leadership, I think quite clearly it has to be a shared job. It won't be one or other of either industry or government, and indeed there are many others that need to play a role. So it is societal, but it has to be shared, and you need within each of those groups for certain people to step up and be more vocal and lead their constituencies. But with respect to industry in particular, I think one of the key issues is the need to include new entrants, the disruptive innovators who represent part of the emerging economy as much as the incumbents. And if we think we are talking to industry when we speak with the incumbents alone, we fail to capture that complexity and the future as much as the past. So that's a very important equation as well, I would say.
Maybe adding to that as well, that it is absolutely certain that business does need certainty from the regulator. So coming back to your point, Laura, the need for leadership from the policy framework is fundamental, but the makers should only be speaking to the incumbents. And I think that's the key, because for the moment, the interaction tends to be the usual type of interaction. So we have to change that interaction to one which is much more disruptive and looking at the way in which society is really moving forward. Nick.
Yes, thank you. Just some quick responses. I think when we've been looking as an inquiry at progress towards a sustainable financial system here in Europe, I think one thing is that Europe is very much a leader in sustainable finance and also has a very distinctive model. And I think perhaps we're seeing a binary, which I don't think really exists, between government and policy and business and market. I think a big element in the European model is actually social innovation. There is actually a very powerful and very sophisticated civil society in Europe around finance. So I think maybe seeing it as a triangle of social and policy innovation. And generally, policy comes last. It's only once you have practice in the market, for example, like reporting, that policy comes in rather quite at the end of the process. Secondly, I think it's really important to recognize that actually the financial community, particularly the investor community, is it is asking for policy and regulation, particularly around disclosure. It is quite different from perhaps traditional dynamics whereby so-called business was seen as being hostile to regulation. There are many parts of regulation which the finance community knew their job properly to be able to invest for the long term. I think maybe another element is that our experience is certainly that this innovation is very, very alive and kicking at the member state level, but we have not yet seen perhaps a European Union dialogue yet. We link those dimensions. And perhaps to Laura's point, I think it's important also to see how we can connect often a very fragmented policy framework. So for example, in the United Kingdom, the reason why the Bank of England has done its work on climate risk is because there is a provision in the Climate Change Act giving the right to the Department of Environment to request all public agencies to do a report on climate change. So the water regulator, the power regulator, but also the financial regulator. So I think there's a union level to think about joined up climate policy, which also incorporates the financial community. And maybe to Sanjeev's point, very much, I think, perhaps thinking about the relationship between financial technology at the small scale level and this agenda and the lending on the green economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Robert Jan.
Thanks very much. Just on the 3 points, on the China and global pledges, the impact of the pledges of other countries on their industry. Let's bet on if any company in China is going to pay anything on these. If they would, that they are paying a lot of money already, for instance, for the energy and coal and whatever you, they basically are loss-making. And that's not a problem in China. Let's see, we have that also to keep that into account. That's the reason why the UK closes now. They have to dump everything on the world below prices. So let's also keep that into account when we discuss China and these pledges. US, same thing, I already mentioned it. So let's see what the actual, if the same is paying. And again, coming back, it's design. What we in Europe having wrong. Coming back to the responsibility and need to courage. Yes, we need a lot of courage. And not only politicians, they take this meeting, scientists. Take the responsibility. If you see that the design is wrong, say it. Dare to speak up, because we don't see that enough. We don't see that the power sector's decarbonization is currently basically being devised by the current design. We don't see in the policymakers that the low carbon incentive in industry can only be met by closures. This is not incentive from policy. So politicians should take this responsibility and have the courage to speak up. We don't see it all. And then it goes back to, for instance, we have for DG RTD sector roadmaps. Those sector roadmaps should be based on the basis for the policy, because that's really what should be the basis of the policy. But for the moment, it's too politicized and too dogmatic. Politicized means tax deals for the moment. So yes, need leadership of politicians, but what a right leadership? This leadership, what we see now, is basically a taxation leadership, and that's a completely different incentive. Bottom-up approach, getting up to that level, and for the moment we have not seen it. And last point is, that means, for instance, industry has process emissions. Other industries have energy inputs. Energy inputs you can do the power sector. Put them in that box. Make the policy more targeted and find a solution. So this is again to the science base. Find a solution to process emissions, which a lot of industries have, as a basis for this. There, let's develop them in a policy. For the moment, it's not being done. So speak up and get the real solutions up. That will be my recommendation.
Just wanted to answer to what Mr. Kumat, ownership and the social dimension of innovation. I think indeed quite important to find ways to increase ownership at the local level of this debate. Let me tell you a few words about the project wing at the ETUC. We have set up a partnership with 7 local trade unions representing workers from regions where they rely on carbon incentive activities. We will, and we have started to organize workshops there where we discuss a background document which is prepared upstreams by a consultant based on interviews, on in-desk research, and during the workshop we discuss what are the opportunities, but also the challenges, the hurdles in moving in these energy-intensive and carbon-intensive regions. And what is striking is, of course, in many regions, what comes forward immediately is the energy system and the industrial ecosystem on this energy system, but also what facilitates the transition is the existence of platforms where at the regional level, at the subnational level, can discuss together local authorities, employers, and trade unions organization on what a local low carbon industrial policy should look like. And it's really interesting to others in that debate, and this is a dimension which is fundamental and which is unfortunately too often missing in that debate. And a final word to answer to your slightly patronizing remark about labor cost and competitiveness. I think that's difficult to address this complex issue without mentioning productivity. If we have high productivity in Europe in many sectors, it's also because we have a well-trained workforce with good employment and also access to a social security system, which makes that workers have a good health in general compared to other regions in the world. I wouldn't like my daughter to live in a world where everything is driven by low innovation and low-cost competitiveness.
Gosh, that's the first time I've been called patronizing. I apologize for that. I do think it's an important factor to take into account when we look now. By all means, we need to put in place the right contractual responsibilities, etc. But let's move on from that. I think it is the broader conversation, part of the broader conversation, as well as all the other social implications that we need to have. And one thing that we haven't talked about, purchasing power, cost, which is the flip side of the price signal. What is the consumer willing to pay? So I think all of these conversations also are linked to the social aspect, which is very important as we transition. Imke, you must ask the organizers. We were supposed to stop at 12:40, but we started late. So do we have a bit more time, or do we need to stop because there's lunch being served outside, or I don't even know what the lunch agreement is? 10 minutes. Okay, great. Great, Imke.
One remark on the who's leading on the energy transition, which is a very interesting question from my point of view. I think there is no clear answer on who should it be, but our view is, and our observations from the project I've mentioned earlier, enabling the countries internationally, it's very clear that because the system has been set up based on a fossil fuel system, based on less flexibility, we get we get changes, which requires intervention from the policy side, as we see on the European energy market, to enable things. So it's not a question of just, making it cost effective. It's getting the conditions in order to end. We have no supply-demand coupling yet. So bringing services up, meaning enabling them, meaning there is a need required. There is a lead required to make that possible. And I think we need a clear commitment from governments to remove these barriers, but supported with clear societal awareness about what is happening and support for. One thing which I think is crucial also in the whole debate is the awareness raising about climate change and the possible impacts, and about what is happening in Europe in terms of loss and damage we've seen in the past. There is not much transparency around that, and not much in Europe, although I would say we are probably very well aware in comparison to other areas in the world. But I think there is more needed in order to enable people to take conscious decisions and to take them along.
Could I ask, Kurt, do you have, before I close, do you have a few reflections based on the conversation this morning that you would like to indulge us with?
Thank you, Sandrine. Well, I listened very attentively. I think there are for science to delve into. Not the scientific science, but as other colleagues have said, the co-designing science. So that there is an evidence base which government and business and all the other stakeholders can use as a common base on which then to discuss. I don't think we would want to put politicians out of a job, far from. But if politicians, with society, a discourse, a debate, based on a number of facts that would be hard to dispute, and maybe a number of science-based, evidence-based transition pathways on how to do this transition, that may help in taking leadership and in business taking leadership, as well as social innovators. Cities, you mentioned, Sandrine, will become increasingly important also in this space. It's a little bit like what the IPCC has been able to do. No one is disputing anymore, except a few marginal people, that climate change is there and that it is extremely likely man-made. That's a fantastic job that has been done by the scientific community. See, where, and my colleagues can testify to this, it's sometimes very hard and challenging to have to get to agreement on your reports with something like 200, including Bolivia, Saudi Arabia, etc. But all these countries are in the IPCC and sign off on the reports. And it does provide for a science base. So what would we be looking for is really indicate this, not on the science of climate change, but on the science on pathways, transition pathways to decarbonizing Europe by 2050. It is not just business or government in this. It's, as some people have said, both together. It really depends on what time frame you take. What is your time horizon? Looking back to the speech of Mark Carney on the 29th of September. If you are and you want to create shareholder value in 10 or 15 or 20 years' time, you know you have to do it differently. You cannot say to your shareholders in a credible way, I'll just continue doing what I'm doing, and then we'll have shareholder value in 20 years' time. It doesn't work. Companies like those in the WBCSD know this, they're working on it. What their problem is that if they are faced with competitors who go for only short, then their investors run away to the other companies. That's where they need governments to come in and make sure that the market signals are such that those who prepare for the transition and lead in the transition will be the winners of the future. Debate and dialogue and productive conversation we need to have between politicians, government, and business and society at large. And we would hope that science really can and will play a role in doing that, so that we know the evidence base. Even if we have to admit we won't have always all the evidence that we need. But at least if we can start building narratives, as you were saying, Sandrine, and acknowledge the facts that no one would be able to dispute, then I think we can. But it does require a different type of science. It does require open science, where there is much more openness in all the data and what we know, what we don't know, where we need to invest to have more science. Also openness and anticipation. Not a couple of scientists, if I may use that caricature, in an ivory tower, but science talking with society. Always making clear that the scientific rigor, the scientific method, has to be respected scrupulously. Method doesn't mean science in their academic surroundings only. It does mean, and it can mean, and it should mean, in a debate, in a conversation. There's a lot more I could say, maybe just on the circular economy, making the link between climate policy and circular economy, because you prompted me to answer this question. It's a message that Hans is always giving. We need to make that link. I think that realization is there. As we are broadening our circular economy from a waste management policy to an economy policy, there will be much more scope and need indeed to bring in the circular economy. I think we're aware of that, we're working on this, but probably we can go a lot further and should go a lot further. I think issues or tools like the Eco-Design Directive, for example, that's a way where we can bring the two together and get them married. If we talk about energy and waste, we will be working on waste to energy to make sure that there is no mismatch between climate energy policies, circular economy policy. Probably the thing that really brings the two together, or should bring the two together, is the life cycle analysis as the fil rouge to bring all this together. But we still have a lot of work to do there. And there again, I think there is a role for science also here to help us in doing this. What I would not want to see is, of course, where we would say, well, if we don't marry the circular economy with the climate policy, both are wrong and there's a wrong design. Let's wait until we have the right together. That we cannot do. I think it's normally, the way it should work is that if you recycle aluminum, for example, you gain in CO2 emissions. That will be accounted for in the ETS, working ETS. So the system is already foreseeing or accounting for this. What we don't know yet is whether the incentives are right in different policy areas so that we reinforce this or accelerate. That's an open question. I wouldn't want to go into that direction. But just to say, yes, we're clearly aware that these things have to come together, and we look to science also to help us there.
Okay, thank you, Kurt. And before I close, maybe just a conversation that we've had, and sorry that we couldn't open it up to actually more questions, and hopefully we can continue over lunch. And I'm hopeful that this is also not the last, but actually the first of many interactions that you will be hosting. I think your challenge, Kurt, is going to exactly what Connie Hedegaard said in her hearing in the Parliament when she first became Commissioner, which was we have to mainstream the idea of transitioning to a low-carbon economy. And it didn't work. It just didn't work. Across the European Commission, we didn't. However, what we did do, and what we're starting to see, is potential areas where we can look at the integrated links, like the circular economy, and we have to get better at actually doing that. If we look at the Energy Union package and the way in which Vice President embraced the move not just to focus on energy security, but actually to focus on a low-carbon energy system, is actually fundamental in part of that transition. So we have opportunities in front of us. There's the reform of the to look now at the interlinkages with the research agenda, and we need to ensure that some of your thinking and other thinking is coming in as we look at the reform of the ETS as well. So it's constantly, in the short term, ensuring that the long-term feasibility of these different policies will be functional within the real economy. And that is our challenge, all of us, as we work together. I think that the final key point within the process, so it's not just talking about the new co-creation system, it's actually how do we truly co-create the policy, truly bring in the research dimension into this and make it short to medium term rather than just long term. And that's a total mind shift within the universities and academia, because they are programmed for very long-term research projects. And I have had this conversation many times. And the last thing that I would say is, let's look at this silent revolution which Nick mentioned. The WBCSD, ourselves, many business leaders, the finance world, we really starting to look at this seriously. It's quite amazing the number of business commitments, non-state actor commitments that have come forward under the NASCA portal, which is the UNFCCC's portal. What we should start to do, actually, is hold those commitments, people behind those commitments. Many of the commitments are here in Europe. Look at those commitments and figure out what do we need to translate those commitments into reality. And that also is something that's in front of us that we can start to do now, potential action areas where we could have immediate impact or impact in the near to medium term. So those would be some of the thoughts that I would have in terms of bringing some of this thinking into what's happening out there. Exciting time, but we need to jump on it now and make sure that we start to put in place the right principles across the policy making, but also the right linkages with the right actors.